Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we explore the connection between mental health and faith. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, neuroscientist, author, and mental health advocate.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Stiers, therapist and trauma researcher. We're so glad you're joining us today. Each week, we have authentic conversations about personal stories, we share professional insights, and explore the meaningful ways faith can influence mental well-being.
Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's conversation.
Welcome back, everyone, to Madness and Grace. This week on this episode, we're going to be talking about religious trauma, how to heal from harmful church experiences. We're going to talk a little bit about what religious trauma is. And yeah, it's an exciting episode. I think a lot of people can understand and relate to it. So as we jump in, before we kind of talk about what religious trauma is, I want to talk about religion and spirituality just kind of as a whole. So there's a lot of research out there that shows that religion and spirituality has really positive effects. It positively affects our well-being, our mental health, our physical health. People who are engaged in religious and spiritual practices have a higher quality of life. They have higher levels of social support, and they positively are able to find meaning in stressful and harmful life events that we all encounter, which can lead to increased levels of happiness and their ability to adjust to distressing and stressful situations. We also know that religion and spirituality can be used to combat the negative effects of experiencing other types of trauma. So physical trauma, psychological trauma, sexual trauma. Religion and spirituality play a huge role in people's ability to heal from, just the distressing aspects of life. But that being said, while we do know that religion and spirituality, and probably a lot of our listeners are really here listening because they are interested in the crossover between mental health and religion and spirituality, we do know that religious trauma does exist. It's something that happens, that people experience, and it can be really disheartening and negatively, in fact, impact a person. There are a lot of definitions for religious trauma, but essentially it's the result of experiencing religious beliefs, practices, or structures that cause harm to a person, either emotionally, psychologically, financially, even physically. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, jumping into really what are the different types of religious trauma, and then how do we move forward healing from them, Matt? So I know, Matt, you've probably dealt a lot with hearing people's different trauma experiences, huh?
Yes, unfortunately, I have. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I do what I do today, is hearing from people coming and telling me or asking me questions around things that pastors or church leaders, congregants had told them or asked them or said, wanted to know from them in relationship to their mental health problem that they might have. And so, I think you laid it out nicely, but I think we just have to kind of, make it really simple for people, which is something I find a lot of times people just don't really think about, particularly people of faith, is that churches can hurt people. Mm-hmm. And so, that's just a fact. And so churches are made up of people. And churches have leadership structures, and you're really talking about relationships between different people, and some people are put into positions of authority over other people or perceived that way, and then maybe perceived as representatives of God, depending on what tradition you're from. And so, there can be a lot of hurt there. So I find a lot of people get hurt, and then they're not, in two ways. One, they're not willing to engage what's happened to them. They're not willing to talk to that church leader or whoever that was within that church setting to say, this has been hurtful to me and I want to talk about it. I'd like to kind of work through that. Or if they've done that, or they feel like that's just not even a possibility for any kind of reconciliation, they're not willing to move beyond that or move on. They're not willing to move to another faith community because they feel like, well, God isn't giving me permission to leave. I'm just going to stay here and just continue to be abused. So, I think a lot of times when people talk about religious trauma, they think about maybe a pastor that gets into a relationship to somebody that's underneath them in a subordinate role or a counselee or something like that. But it could be, things like legalism or just control of individuals. It could be things like, we were talking earlier today, you and I were talking about doing this. Things like purity culture, where you're trying to constrain people's romantic relationships, things like excommunication, you're putting them out of the church, spiritual manipulation, and then, of course, just kind of abrasive, authoritarian types of leadership. And I think, I'll just make this point, let you kind of jump in here, that ultimately, at the end of the day, whether someone's willing to say it or not, what most people are thinking about when they're being hurt by the church is that, well, this is God that's doing this. These people represent God, and what they're doing is representative of Him. And if they're like this, then I don't want to have anything to do with this church and with this God. And that's where the great damage comes. And I do also believe that there are those who are involved in these kind of abusive behaviors, and they understand that they're involved in these abusive behaviors and then hurry people. And I think there's other people that are involved in these abusive behaviors and they don't see them as abusive.
Yeah.
And so they don't think they're hurting any.
I think it just becomes kind of pervasive within that church or that institution or that religion. And it's almost, it's kind of masked and justified as love. Like,
right, absolutely.
This is the loving approach that God has for us, and you just don't understand that, right? And that ultimately leaves someone feeling very confused and conflicted with what they're being told externally and what their internal experience is. And, ultimately all of this kind of boils down into someone feeling very shamed and very guilty of something that
Right.
they've been told that they're doing or not doing, right? So we've got people that are being alienated, publicly shamed. I think when we talk, I know for me at least, when you say religious trauma, I think people typically think of the sexual abuse that you hear about in the news, right? Like that is very overt. Of course that happens. We are very aware of that. And that absolutely is religious trauma, but it's also a physical and sexual trauma, right? So you're experiencing multiple types of trauma at that point. There's this
I
underlying...
would say everyone can understand that that's trauma. Like everybody can, if a woman is sexually assaulted, virtually no one will say that's not a traumatic experience. That meets our general definition of trauma.
Exactly. And religious trauma is a newer kind of area of trauma. It's not in the DSM. It's not diagnosable. It really only kind of emerged in clinical use in therapy settings and whatnot in the 1990s so trauma is a new concept in the mental health world, newer in the last few decades.
Right.
And this is even newer because it's pervasive, and what it looks different with every interaction and whatnot.
Right.
And it's they've done studies. Again, there's not a whole lot of research out there. A lot of it is qualitative, so interviews with individuals who have experienced abuse in their religious institution. But one of the more recent studies, they found that about a third of the respondents reported that they had experienced some sort of religious trauma based on a measure that they had sent out in a survey. And that's wild. That's a lot of people. And they're assuming that about 20% of the US adults are still attending or engaging in communities, that are practicing in ways that are harmful and damaging to people. And it's really...
It can really be an issue of definition, I think,
right.
Because you're certainly going to have, if you look at the full continuum or the distribution of all of this, you're going to have some people on one end that are going to do something very extreme, and anyone would say it's abusive.
Right.
You're going to have people on the other end who are, if there's ever any resistance or questioning of anything they do, they're going to say they've been traumatized. And then you're going to have the big middle, where it's, one person sitting next to you in the pew may not recognize it as trauma, whereas you do. And there's going to, and then the person's going to say, no, I'm loving you. I'm just trying to shepherd you, guide you. No, this, so it's going to be a difficult definition. So I would say something as simple as saying that religious trauma results from distorted religious application. So it's applying religious teachings or hierarchies or structure in a way that distorts what they were meant for. So like you mentioned something earlier that I hear a lot of times, and I've heard a lot over the years, this idea of, well, it's just love. I'm doing this in love.
Right.
And, the reality is, there are times that you might have to tell someone in a religious context that a certain behavior that they're involved in or the problems that they're struggling with are related to something they've done or shouldn't be doing or whatever that might be. But, we do that in the real world too, outside of a spiritual environment.
Absolutely.
And we don't, and people might not like it. They might go, hey, there's no business of yours how I live my life. Okay. And so, what I find is that, when I look through the scriptures, when it talks about love, it's talking about love. And so love is not divisive. Love is grace-oriented. Love is comforting and caring. Love is a positive feeling. Love is, and so again, that's not to say that there aren't difficult interactions, but there's difficult interactions outside of the spiritual world that no one would ever refer to as trauma. And so I think, when it's like, well, you better stop doing that behavior or we're going to shun you from this organization. We're going to cast you out. I think that's where we start to get into really difficult questions. I mean, you mentioned some research. I mean, there's a lot of research done just around, and again, I think the issue becomes kind of how do you define religious trauma? High levels of anxiety, depression, complex PTSD for individuals that have experienced it. And that was particularly true for individuals that had involved in situations where there were kind of coercive control. So they're using the religion to control people. Or kind of shame-based doctrines, And what's interesting, I think, is if they listen closely as we're talking about this, I think what's probably going to pop in your head is, wait, are they talking about churches or are they talking about cults? And so, because a lot of times you're going to hear the same kind of, and I think that's an easier way for people to think about this, and that is, what we're talking about are churches, and we're talking about churches that cross a line, or individuals within churches that cross a line in which they decide that they want to control people for whatever reason, or they want to assert a certain level of authority over them that's beyond what they should, or they want to be representative of God in a way that damages a person. And so, again, that sounds very cult-like. And so I think, a cult is really just a set of followers or a set of believers. And so it makes sense.
And that's the abuse, right? Is this distortion of the ideologies in a way that's used to coerce and manipulate individuals. And the result of that is that individuals are impacted negatively. I mean, it's damaging and it's stress related. So if you've listened to some of our other podcasts that talk about, anxiety and PTSD and stress response in the brain, things like that, like this isn't just someone said something at church that you didn't agree with and you took offense to it and you're upset now. This is typically chronic, pervasive distortion of an ideology or a belief that has a negative and lasting, oftentimes, impact on an individual's physical health, mental health, and spiritual health. I mean, I see so many people in the therapy room that come in and, we integrate religion and spirituality into the work that we do here in therapy, to whatever degree the individual is interested in. And oftentimes, it's kind of, you get, yes, yeah, I love this. I want to talk about it. We know that religion and people's faith can be, a foundation for their strength and their coping skills. And it's so foundational for so many people. And when that's been abused and distorted, they come in with church hurt, essentially, but to a higher degree. And they're really saying, I don't trust people in churches. I don't trust anybody in that space. I've been so violated, whether physically or otherwise, that this has been damaging to my spiritual journey. It's not, so this takes another level into it that, you hear people who have been physically abused or sexually abused and how that can have lasting impacts on their sexual health and their relationships. I mean, same thing we see here with religious traumas, especially if you grew up in it and you didn't have the ability to make a conscious decision to step away. This is kind of continuously pushed through for you. And at some point you step away from it, you grow into adulthood and you can say, this is not something I'm interested in engaging in any longer. You step away and the damage has been done, that negative and lasting effect on your spiritual development and journey. And so many of the people that I sit with in sessions we talk to is they're really undoing a lot of the shame and the guilt that has been just placed in their head. I mean, it's so similar to other types of trauma. So like sexual trauma is one that I work with a lot, where especially women who have experienced that, I am bad, I am wrong, I'm not a good person is the message that they're left with after experiencing these traumas. It's very similar with someone who's experienced a religious trauma because they're actually also being told that, right? Like, you are sinful. You have done something that you should be ashamed of, and taking things and kind of spinning it in a way that even publicly shaming them in front of congregations, things like that. It's an interesting dynamic because it's also relational, right? Then they're struggling with their relationship with God, and what does that look like? It's the humans that did bad things, and God allowed it. So how does that play in? And it's an interesting one to
God placed them in the position to be able to do that to me, or so yeah, I think you make a good point there that we're not talking about somebody who said something to you at church that hurt your feelings. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I mean that's just being a human, and just, if you didn't have it today, just wait till tomorrow, and that's that kind of thing. So, and we're also not necessarily just talking about what you would think of in the extreme. So, I think a lot of times when people talk about religious trauma, they think of kind of these extremist groups, kind of like maybe fundamentalist Mormon groups that, live out in a compound out in the desert, and, they're marrying underage women, and, this
really
guy
radicalized.
Exactly. And the man who's in charge says, okay, well, but you've been a bad follower, so I'm taking your wife and giving it to another person. And that kind of extreme control, and absolutely, that's absolutely traumatizing. And when you talk to people that have left those situations, they are damaged, and their faith is damaged. And, but you have to start to kind of work your way back towards normal behavior, or normal, kind of church hierarchies or authorities. And so, there's going to be a point where you get to a line, and then on the other side of that line, it's not traumatizing, but you make a good point. It's a chronic, ongoing, you might almost use the term systemic. It's like part of the system of that congregation. Since we're really very post-denominational today, that congregation is dysfunctional, and from the leadership level, and people are being hurt. I found an interesting article from 2019 that actually looked at individuals who had experienced religious trauma, and actually found that their well-being scores improved if they disaffiliated from that religious context, and then that was paired with supportive relationships and kind of meaning making, finding purpose. And so, I say that for those out there who may have experienced religious trauma, or may feel like they're going through it right now, that there is a benefit from disaffiliating yourself from that context. That doesn't mean you don't believe anymore necessarily. It doesn't mean you're not necessarily even going to be affiliated with religious institution or organization, but that religious context, disaffiliating from it can be very beneficial. I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about kind of practicals for, say, families and ministry staff. I know a lot of times over the years, I've been told both by family members, how do I help my loved one who was hurt by this church? How do I, or when I'm doing pastor training, pastor says, well, this couple has come to me now. They're going to come to our church. They were hurt by this other church. How do we help them? And, I think those are really good questions, because I think a lot of times we try to fix in ways that might be sometimes more harmful. So for families, I put a few things down. I think really number one, you just have to listen without judgment. I think the most important thing there is your role is not to try to defend the church or religion or God. I think it's just to listen. And so even if the person's saying things that you don't particularly like or agree with, they're trying to begin to work through some very deep pain. And I think you just have to listen, just very honestly, and just kind of just be there, and not try to change what they're saying. I think you have to validate their pain, that their pain is real. Don't minimize it. Well, things happen, and, that kind of stuff. I think you just have to be compassionate. I think you have to let them kind of explore. I think that goes with the listening. I think if they're like, how would God let this happen? Or again, I don't think you need to try to come up with these perfect answers. I think you need to just be there to listen. Think you need there to affirm their willingness to begin to share. And I think you have to be patient, because I think healing, indeed is a process, particularly from trauma. And so, I think those are some simple ways. And those, you may say, well, that sounds super simple. I don't know if that's going to do anything. Well, I think it helps a person start a conversation, and it helps them know that there's an anchor out there that's willing to just be present and listen, and not judge them or try to fix them, or, oh, you shouldn't say things like that. God doesn't like it when you say things like that. I mean, they've been hurt.
And one of the things I'm kind of elaborating on what you've said is, I think if you're the person that's sitting down with someone who's sharing their story or their experience, you're probably someone who's interested in helping people, right? And oftentimes helpers want to be able to give solutions and answers and provide information. And that's not always necessary or actually helpful. So sometimes if someone's telling you something, you're using this listening ear, but why did this happen? Why did the church let this? Why, asking questions. And you don't have to have the answer for everything. Like, it is absolutely okay to say, I don't know. I don't know. Because what's happening is that person is processing what's happened to them, and they don't understand it. And for you to say, I don't know, because you don't know all of the details of everything. Like, you just don't. And so for just to say, I'm right here with you, and in some confusion as to how this happened, really can be a connecting point for that person. And you can be, a place of, some safety for them, which is wonderful. One of the things that we know through religious trauma, and it's typically more, I think, thought of or related to, again, more physical or sexual trauma in a church environment. But there's we're being told to forgive the abuser.
Right.
I think, whether the abuse is still ongoing or not, there's this forgiveness component of, you just need to forgive them and move forward. And while that might be a part of that person's own healing journey, that's not necessarily for anyone outside of, their therapy or psychiatrist's appointment to really kind of walk through that with them. So telling someone you have to forgive this abuser almost re-traumatizes. It can have a really negative impact on a person. It's like, yeah, we heard what you said. You weren't happy. You experienced some trauma. Now just get over it. I mean, that's the message that they're going to hear.
Well, I mean, I've actually, sadly, both read about or experienced, not personally, but being involved with other people, which individuals were forced to forgive an abuser publicly with the abuser there in front of a congregation or in front of a group of people from the congregation. In one instance in which it was a child who had been sexually abused by a janitor at a church. I mean, I know that just to a lot of people sounds unbelievable. Like, who in the world would think that was a good idea? Very naive people would have thought that was good. I mean, because, God calls us to forgive others, and
it is a common theme that I hear in therapy sessions, is that
the idea that perhaps, forgiveness might be a beneficial part of kind of trauma recovery is certainly not wrong. But to put a victim with an abuser in a setting in which, the abuse is still fresh, and force them to, in a sense, what it's saying is, like you said, minimizes everything that's happened. And so I think, we've got to be very careful about those types of things. The key to me to help someone move forward from religious trauma is to help them separate God's character from human failure. I think that is the key, because it's always all wrapped up together. So, Pastor so-and-so did this, or the church I went to does this, and this is all the things they've done to us over the years. And well, I don't believe in God anymore. I'm going to leave the church. My faith is, and so, I can understand that, but you really have to have someone help you separate the character of God. And I'll just give you some sad but real experiences that I have been a part of. So I think one that, well, I may have mentioned on here before, I was doing a pastor training, and a pastor there afterwards, doing pastor training on mental health, said, I have a couple that has come to my church from another church, and they were really hurt by that church, and I need to know how to better minister to them. So they had an 8-year-old child that had a behavioral problem, a mental health related behavioral problem, and that child acted out in the Sunday school. Ultimately, at one point, so there'd been a constant ongoing conflict and conversation around this, and the parents were, really struggling to even be able to go to church. So one would stay home, one would go to Sunday school with the child, one would stay in the service. I mean, there's a lot of different things they were trying. But then ultimately one day the child threw a toy, hit another child in the head and lacerated the child's head. I mean, it wasn't like a life-threatening kind of thing. The child kind of had to get some stitches. So the leadership of the church actually got a restraining order against the family to keep the child from coming to the church. I'll just stop for a minute and let you gasp, out in the audience out there. And so this was the new pastor from the new church and wanted to know what was the best way to deal with that. How do they help walk that family back so that they know God wants them at church? God wants to be in a relationship with them. I mean, and they were asking all the right questions, but somebody thought that was a good idea. And I can go on. I can give you an example of, all mine are mental health related because obviously that's what I do. I can give you an example of a woman that I worked with that was in a group that I led for a while and did some individual care with through an organization. And, she stood up against a wall and had Bibles thrown at her to knock demons out of her because her mental health problems were caused by demons. And that, almost is such a almost laughable caricature that you want to grin when you hear that. But imagine how traumatizing it is. I mean,
it's almost like cinematic. Like it's like that's something that would happen in a movie, not in real life. And these things happen in real life.
And these things happen in real life. And they're not always extreme like that. They can be an overly authoritarian pastor who controls every aspect of his congregants' lives, to their decrement, so there's all kinds I think that's where this gets all kind of, difficult to define and talk about because it can come in a lot of different, and it certainly all comes wrapped up in quote unquote Christian love, as you said earlier. And it may even be loosely associated with established Christian teaching. Forgiving others is important when you've been wrong.
And what a shame that is, because it, like you were saying, working through discerning the difference between God and man and what you've experienced can be an important part of that healing process. And it's such a shame because just what you were saying is the nature of this is that especially if you're a child going through this, that's raised in an environment you're exposed to this sort of thing. Your idea, your image of God is going to be impacted by what is happening around you in that environment. So to sit down, and this is what I see in sessions, right? Like to sit down and parse through what is man and what is God is really challenging for these individuals because they've been told and have learned that this shame and guilt that they're experiencing is what God wants them to experience when they, quote, step out of line even slightly. And so it's been so distorted that almost unraveling it is painful and goes against their core beliefs, this worldview that they've grown to develop of this is what God is, and this is how my perception of him is, because this is what I've been taught. And now that I've stepped away from it, I'm so conflicted because that's what I believe. And I also know it's not true and I still believe it. And so it really becomes a very messy process. And it's so sad because I definitely know personally the impact that religion has had on, and my faith has had on my life. And I feel honored to get to sit with people as they walk through that. But it can be very challenging and very, very, very painful. Very painful.
Absolutely.
Because if God is love and this is how they've experienced that, it's confusing for them.
Absolutely. And, I would, there's a lot of things I'd say to that. And number one, Jesus is very countercultural, very much at odds with the religious leaders of his day because of some of their oversteps. And, also if we look in the scriptures, there's a lot of verses. I could sit here for quite some time and give you verses that really hold, the shepherd, the leader, to account for their behavior and their actions at a higher level than even a congregant is held. And so, I look at something like Ezekiel 34. Someone might have never thought I would start with an Old Testament verse, but Ezekiel 34, 2-4 starts out with the ultimate and negative statement in the Bible, which is the woe. Whenever you see woe, that's a bad, bad thing. And so it's, that's the ultimate bad. And Ezekiel says, woe to the shepherds. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. He's talking to the religious leaders of his day. And God is going to bring a judgment upon them. And so there's no doubt that people are held accountable from a faith perspective, but they do hurt people. And I think a lot of times that's another problem, not only that congregates have, like I said, just admitting to themselves or saying out loud that churches or religious leaders in churches can hurt people, even ones that seem like they're good guys, good people that want to help people. But I also think that's a problem with ministry staff when they're trying to help people through these things, like you've been talking about, Maddie. I think one of the first things that they, if you're a ministry staff, if you're another pastor, if you're that pastor that asked me that question, I remember giving that person some answers. I think one of the first things you have to do is you have to be willing to acknowledge to that person that indeed churches and ministry staff and clergy can do real damage to people. I don't think you try to walk around it or talk around it or go, oh, well, he really has a good intention, or that's such a good denomination. I think you need to say, hey, you know what? I know this stuff happens. It absolutely happens. I think you have to be a safe presence for them. You got to listen more than you speak. So that just gets to the don't fix them kind of approach. I think you have to be real careful to not start dropping kind of the spiritual cliches like, just forgive or trust God more. I also think, to be very careful about re-traumatizing an individual in the sense that, trying to get them too actively involved in the faith community too quickly. Oh, why don't you just start coming to this Bible study? I think it'd be really good for you. Because, they're just trying to baby step their way back, and I think you need to affirm that. And then I would really say also to ministry staff out there or clergy, collaborate with a counselor or therapist that has experience with trauma and work together to help this person, because there's a lot of trauma work that needs to be done, and there are a lot of great psychological interventions for that. And that takes a load off of you. It allows you to be more like a pastor or a spiritual guide and not have to worry so much about the psychological effects of the trauma. And it just brings, more tools to bear in helping this individual walk along. So, it's a tremendous issue. Unfortunately, you and I are in a situation where a lot of the people that come to the Hope and Healing Center, they come here because they've been hurt by churches, or, we end up connecting with people in the community and through books I've written or things like that, because they know that we know, and so I think it's not surprising to us when we come across these. It makes us angry. I know you and I have had plenty of conversations that I know I've wanted to jump in my car and drive over to a church and say some ugly things to people before. Why did you do that to this person? But, I think a lot of people out there, this might be kind of a shock to them to hear this. They may just think about that religious trauma as, like we've said, these kind of really overt abusive situations, mostly sexual abuse. But, I think I would use as your kind of low-level metric the kind of overly authoritarian pastor who has to control every aspect of everything that goes on at his church to a point that's so invasive that his congregants second guess doing anything.
Right. We're questioning or asking for more information is absolutely not okay, right? Like, you should be able to question your faith and have conversations with your leaders and say, like, this is how I'm feeling today. And it's a part of developing faith, right? And to question just like, well, why are we doing Sunday school this way kind of thing? It's just immediately shut down. There's no space for understanding and trying to be transparent about things, as
And your question, your faith is called into question, and your status within this, or position, or role, or even willingness or ability to even be at this church is called into question for even asking a question.
And that in and of itself is the manipulation, right? Like how, you must be of weaker faith, or I'm questioning your, actual faith because you've questioned me, right? Which is really the opposite of how it should be. We should be able to inquire and ask questions and look for support from our.
I think a lot of times, we get into trouble with a lot of this. I think, again, I'm not defending, church leaders that have gone too far. They've stepped over the line. Because, the Bible does use words, or at least in English, we translate those words as things like submission, or authority. And so we do have within within most church structures within Christendom, we do have some kind of hierarchical structure, be that just within the congregation where you have a lead pastor or a senior pastor, or maybe elders, and so that you're that's the shepherd over the flock type of thing. And, if you look at a more hierarchical example, you might say something like the Catholic Church, where you really start with the highest level, the Pope, and then it kind of works its way down. But you have these hierarchies, and there's nothing wrong with these hierarchies in and of themselves. It's how those hierarchies are used to shepherd the flock. And I think that's the thing that we have to keep reminding ourselves. Shepherds, the literal shepherds, they don't go out into the field and beat their sheep.
Right.
They're there to protect the sheep, and they're there to tend to the sheep so that their quality of life, or that they thrive, and so I think that's and Jesus is the good shepherd. And I think it's really interesting that he used that term, that he's the good shepherd, because it implies that there are some not so.
Natural.
There really does. There really, it implies there are bad shepherds. And so he's the good shepherd, and he only has the sheep in mind. He wants to take care of the sheep and care for the sheep and love the sheep. And so, again, not to say that there aren't hard moments where difficult conversations have to be had, but, we have difficult conversations all the time in life, and people don't walk away from them feeling as if they've been traumatized and that God is shaming them or shunning them. And so I think that's, there's a line that we have to be careful. But I just think remembering the idea that ministry staff and clergy within a faith community are there to shepherd the flock. And shepherding is a caring, tending, loving kind of approach. It doesn't mean, again, that you don't have to talk about difficult things or won't have disagreements. But, I think at the end of the day, and I think you and I are sounding a little bit kind of like touchy-feely psychologist right now. I think at the end of the day, the average person out there knows what trauma is. They know that an experience is negative, and that hurt someone and damaged them. I don't think that we have to go through and try to explain to them why, if you take a 12-year-old girl that was sexually assaulted by a janitor in a church, and you make her stand up in front of a group of people from the church with the janitor right there and tell him that you forgive him for what he did to you, that's a bad thing.
Right.
You don't have to have a particular high level of biblical knowledge to understand that is a traumatizing experience. And now she's been traumatized twice. And one of those is at the feet of the church, and so I think that we might have a few that we might kind of go banter back and forth, like, wasn't it? But I'd say more often than not, we know. And so if you're out there and you are in a situation where you feel like your church is traumatizing you or your family or another individual, I think you just need to sit down and ask yourself, would the average church do this? Would an average individual that experiences be traumatized? Is this beneficial for me, my faith, my family, or is this detrimental for me, my faith, and my family? How are other people experiencing this? Do other people experience this and it brings them joy and happiness? and I'm the only one that sees it as negative? I mean, answers to almost any of those questions are going to help you realize that you're either in a positive or a negative religious context. And as I said, what the research shows is that you disaffiliate yourself from that situation with supportive care, with supportive relationships, you're more likely to improve.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And taking into consideration all of that, and like you said, go and check out another church home. See if that's even if you land on no, there's no trauma, religious trauma happening, but I'm not happy here. That's fine too. Finding a place that you're happy and you feel fulfilled and you're gaining your spiritual support and your social support that you're needing. That's what it is about. So. Well, thank you all.
Don't do it alone. Make sure you connect with some supportive friends, family, other clergy congregants outside of the church you're in that you're concerned about. Don't try to do it within. Try to get some connection outside.
Right.
Well, I guess that's a conversation. It's a difficult conversation to have. We probably could talk about this all day. We could look at all different kinds of examples. We could talk about complex aspects of the trauma. But ultimately, the faith community is supposed to be a healing community, a loving community that cares for those that are hurt and seeks to improve their spiritual lives, seeks to improve them as people and as followers of Jesus, and not to berate them, beat them down, cut them down, tear them down. So I think, common sense sometimes can lead us a little bit better sometimes than these really complex psychological definitions that we give. So thanks for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again on the Madness and Grace podcast as we have conversations around mental health and faith.
Thanks for joining our conversation on this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. If you found value in our discussion today, we'd love it if you'd subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It helps others find these important conversations.
Sharing this podcast with friends and family members is also a wonderful way to extend hope to those who might be struggling with mental health concerns.
We'll be back next time with another candid conversation about madness and grace. See you then.